War is hell. But before Vietnam, most films wouldn't portray it as a true vision of hell. One side of the spectrum would romanticize it through patriotism and honor, while leaving out most of the elements of the trauma and horror that goes along with it. And the other side of the spectrum just wants to focus on the hell and depravity of it all. Probably the best option is to show a little bit of both. Just adding elements about hope and triumph along with the condemnation of just war. This at least would allow the films to appeal to a more broader audience, being able to just speak on a more personal and human level. Giving you the necessary emotions and feelings of anger, sorrow, and just reflection. However, Fires on the Plain is anything but that. It's a Japanese anti-war film from 1959, and it was part of a very small number of pre-1970s war films that like to focus on its truest, ugliest state. A hopeless nightmare where no one really wins as all hints of hope are removed from the picture entirely. This is the truest depiction of hell. It's a place where redemption is impossible. A place that feeds on your worst fears. And it just lingers on that suffering. And it just brings the suffering upon you, the audience. This really is, as I present you, the most disturbing movie about the Pacific War. So at this point, I might have accidentally changed my channel into one just about disturbing anti-war films. Probably the only person in history that's happened to, but, it's gotta happen to someone. So we'll have to see how my mental health goes from here. But I would be lying to you if I said I wasn't enjoying it just a little bit. And it all started with my patrons. I made the decision to have them vote on the next projects. And luckily for me, they picked Masaki Kobayashi's The Human Condition. 9.5 hours of pure misery. Don't you just love democracy? But when I say misery, the movie isn't bad at all. Could really even be a masterpiece. But it's not exactly a movie that makes you feel good. It makes you feel horrible. It has a very anti-war message. It's broken up into 3 over 3-hour-long films. But the films work well as just breaking up the story into different acts. But really, by the time you're all done with it, much like with the main protagonist of the film, you're just beyond exhausted and broken. You're just surviving at that point. And I admit, afterwards, I just felt really depressed. It really just made you feel bad. There was no hope or joy at all in any of the movies. But then I started to think about it, and you really could turn all those negative emotions into motivation. If actual people during the war suffered like they did in that film, people even like my grandfather that I knew who actually fought in the Pacific War, so it definitely gave me some relatability in that way. But if him and all the soldiers are willing to go through that kind of pain, then we currently have it pretty good. And there's a scene in Fires on the Plain that really just stood out to me. And it's where you see a character who actually cries after eating salt. Actual literal salt. When you see something like that, then you have it good. And now, whenever I feel like I'm suffering through something or in some kind of pain, I could just think of these films and then really ask myself, am I really suffering? If the people in these stories could continue to fight on for something so hopeless, why can't I? But, stories about survival are even more effective when they're true. And they're just always great for anyone looking for any kind of motivation. And trust me, after you watch movies like this or The Human Condition, you'll love your life. So I ended up picking Fires on the Plane because I did receive multiple recommendations for it on my Human Condition video. What really sold me on it though was one comment saying that he would never watch it again. And after watching it, I could definitely see what was meant by that. This really is like nothing I've ever seen before. So, Fires on the Plane released in 1959. It was directed by Kon Ichikawa. This is a very prominent Japanese director, especially at this time. And this was also coming not too long after his other anti-war film, and probably his most famous film, and that is the Burmese Harp. And if you haven't guessed by now, I'll probably be covering that one very soon. But Fires on the Plane follows the Japanese soldiers from an infantry unit. This takes place on a lone island during Japan's campaign in the Philippines. And we follow the main protagonist named Tamara. He's a Japanese soldier and he's suffering from tuberculosis. And the medics refuse to help him, and he's basically told by his commanding officers to kill himself. In fact, he's told just to do just that. Everyone around him is shell-shocked, debilitated by disease, constantly under the dread of a much bigger, unseen enemy, starved, and even eventually reduced to cannibalism. And that last part's definitely one of the more horrific things that this film does show. And the title of the film represents the smoke that we constantly see in the distance. And for the main protagonists, it's not war that this represents, but sanity. The smoke represents that the farmers are still going about their lives unchanged. Amongst all the chaos, they've kept their sanity. And as long as the protagonist can see that smoke, then he believes that there's still a possibility of him going home. And when you think about that, that's just so devastating. You know, if he's mistaken, then all of his hope is gone. And when I was watching this, I gotta say, I was really just reminded why I love Japanese cinema so much. Especially just from this time period. You know, there's just such a unique look about this. You know, no other movie could really capture it. And it was amazing how Ichikawa was able to just make the Philippines look so bleak and even cold. And just Setsuo Kobayashi's black and white photography. They really just give the sense that the landscape has so much hostility to it. It almost resembles the barrenness of Kobayashi's The Human Condition. You know, that one had empty plains, where this is the opposite. It's jungle, but it's just as bleak. And bodies are just strewn everywhere. They just litter the entire jungle. In one of the villages, there's this whitewashed church that really just sticks out and almost resembles hope. But at its doorway is just a giant pile of corpses. This is the tropical version of Stalingrad. You know, what's funny is probably people like vacation at this actual spot, but the filmmakers were able to just turn it into a nightmare. You really could just smell the rotting decay. And I just feel so bad for soldiers that had to fight in these poor conditions. You know, little to no food, no medical supplies. And when you watch it, you know, you might have some knowledge of just how unsanitary things are that are going on in the film, and it really just makes you so uncomfortable. The whole time you're just saying to yourself, you know, even if these guys get rescued, are they gonna die of disease or infection? You know, how could someone really survive after this? Jungle warfare really is just so brutal, and I'm really amazed that, you know, people like my grandfather went on to live a full life after serving in a war like this. And I wondered too if there was anyone from Japan's side that went on to live a full life after fighting in something like this. This film definitely highlights just how much worse the conditions were for Japan, at least in this sort of battle. And when you watch it, it just makes you want them to just surrender. It would be so much better and actually help them if they did. But everyone's just so fearful and untrusting, and for good reason, so they're all just kind of stuck. This film really is just a suffocating experience. But at the same time, too, it's just very suspenseful, and it really just keeps your interests, and you're just stuck watching it once you start it. And you really get the sense of starvation with this film. You can actually see it in the actors. They really did fast for this movie. And they look like skeletons. You actually forget that you're watching a movie when you watch this. Eventually all the characters end up looking the same in a way. Skinny, sickly, and you could just feel and drift into insanity with them. And it's probably why the main protagonist does some really, confusing and horrific things. It all just goes with that chaos of a war. Not everything really just has to make sense. And this film just does that so well. And I really just love the pacing in this film. It gets straight to the point. It clocks in at only an hour and 40 minutes. So again, once you start it, it's easy to finish. You're not going to be sitting there and suffering for 9.5 hours. But I was honestly just hoping for a better payoff. Instead, it's really just nihilism. And that's very typical of just Asian cinema, especially whenever just depicting war. I'll also say that if you're viewing this and you're depressed already, it could make you more depressed, so I would say be careful. For me, it actually did the opposite, but that's just because I was able to view it more as something to motivate me. But I could just see it going both ways, so it could potentially just be a dangerous film for some people to watch. And even though this movie is old, it still is very effective. And just the themes about cannibalism, sickness, starvation, war, violence, they're all just depicted in a very effective and real way. And I do know about Shinya Tsukamoto's version of this film. He actually did a remake. And I am just really excited to watch that because he is one of my most favorite directors of all time. But I could definitely see why he did like this movie. And it's cool that he decided to do his own version of it. I really can't wait to see that. And when I looked into that, apparently Tsukamoto's version was actually shot on location. So that's definitely going to be interesting. But I will say Ichikawa did do just a remarkable job of recreating just the hellish, battle-ravaged landscapes of the Philippines. Despite the production never leaving Japan. So Fires on the Plain is no doubt a special film, and one that'll stay with me forever. But more so, it's a pioneer of just the anti-war film genre. It was almost non-existent when this film released, not until decades later. Now pretty much every war movie is required to be anti-war, but still it's just interesting seeing one from just that time period. It really shouldn't exist. But it is just always a very effective genre, and that's why I just want to see more films from it. And it does such a good job at just communicating a feeling to the audience. You always get something out of war movies. And our generation may not know war, but everyone knows survival. It's ingrained within us. Subconsciously, it's something we can all relate with. And it does take a very special movie like this to remind us of that, even if that would mean delving into hell itself. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please recommend me more anti-war films, or just movies in general you want me to cover. And if you like my channel, subscribe, leave a thumbs up, and you can support me by my Patreon. The link is in the description box below. And like always, thanks for watching.